Hi, everyone. Let's go ahead and talk about some early postmodern lit. All right, so we'll go ahead and start with Seamus Heaney. He was born in 1939 and died in 2013, so pretty recently. In my Norton Anthology, it just lists his birth date, so I had to look up actually when he died. He's born in County Derry in Northern Ireland. And just kind of like a note on that too, he's born in a pretty contentious time in Irish history and specifically in Northern Ireland. And he's Catholic, meaning that he's part of there's like a lot of contention around like how we talk about these issues and everything, but part of a minority in Ireland who we tend to think of when we think of the Troubles as fighting for their rights and things like that, as they were discriminated against for jobs and things like that, housing. And so that's really important to his background. So he was a teacher and lecturer in Ireland for a bit before he became a Harvard professor and then late in life an Oxford professor. So even though he did teach at Harvard and Oxford, he did live in Dublin for most of his life. I think he moved there in 1976, and then he was there when he died. Um, so we know him for his poetry. We know him for, a lot of his writing. One of the things that we know him for, maybe most prominently, other than poetry, is his translations, and specifically his translation of Beowulf has been like very, very well received. And I've read it, and I think it's just like one of the more popular translations of Beowulf. And particularly just, if you like me, have appreciated reading Seamus Heaney's poetry this past week. He just has such a way with words and with meter. It's just lovely to read him tell the story of Beowulf. And he won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1995, so it's not just my opinion. He is he's a very beloved writer. Okay, so one of his more famous poems is Digging. This is, I think it's the first poem in his collection. Um, oh shoot, and now I'm sorry, Death of a Naturalist, right? And this is, I think, a pretty good poem, I think, for even defining Seamus Heaney. Like if I was gonna say, oh, have you ever read anything by him? Then I might point people to this because I think it's it's almost like his own thesis statement, right? Like about who he is, who he wants to be, where he comes from. And so we see he's describing his father and grandfather in this poem, their practices of potato farming, gathering peat. And one of the things that I love about this poem, and I think that Haney is just so famous for, is the earthiness, right? The sensual details that we have. And so I have a couple lines here, like the cold smell of potato mold, the squelch and slap of soggy peat. It's just like you're getting a lot of details that are helping you think about like what it smells like, what it looks like, what it sounds like. It's really painting this sort of this image for us, this idea of what he's experiencing. And there's kind of a narrative too of him like looking outside the window, right? And seeing his father. Um, at the same time, I think that this poem isn't devoid of it's not so serious, right? He's like talking about his father's backside, right? So there is like a little bit of not so self-serious, but at the same time, he is, like I said, it is a bit of a thesis statement for his own defining who he is as a poet. He says he has this extended metaphor beginning at the beginning and then in the first lines, and then in the last lines, he kind of wraps up this metaphor, but he says at the beginning, between my finger and my thumb, the squat pin rests snug as a gun. And then at the end, he says, between my finger and my thumb, the squat pin rests, I'll dig with it. Right. And so kind of comparing this action of writing poetry to the more physical labor that his father and grandfather did, and seeing the way that his own poetry is tied back to those traditions and to that history. And I would point out too, even though this poem is beautiful and not totally serious, right? But also, like so much beautiful sensory detail and everything. There is this line here about snug as a gun, right? There is still kind of this like hovering like violence. He's not necessarily engaging with it, but I do feel like it's like there's a trace of it there. Um, Okay, and maybe it's just like a pen is mightier than the sword thing. Maybe that, but I can't help but read into a mention of a gun from him, especially at the time that he wrote that poem. Okay, Casualty. This is another one of his real famous poems. This is an elegy about Lewis O'Neill. And O'Neill died. He didn't die at Bloody Sunday, right? He didn't die in that on that day. But this was conflicts in Northern Ireland after Bloody Sunday, just kind of like I can't think of the word, but sort of these like intermittent conflicts, intermittent violent moments that happen after when there's like escalated police presence and people kind of the word I can think of is guerrilla. I don't think that's the right word, but kind of people outside, and there's just tension is very high, right? So he was not participating, right? He's not a soldier. He is just this like old fisherman who likes to drink and chat with Haney at the bar. Um, I mean, according to this poem, right? One thing that's important to note, I think, is that Haney never actually mentions Lewis O'Neill. And we've read enough elegies this semester that I think, you've seen other examples of how people might title the poem after the person who they're, remembering or memorializing, or they might at least mention their name, right? His name is never mentioned. And um, I got this quote from the Poetry Foundation I thought was pretty helpful for kind of figuring out maybe like what that choice might have been about. It says it's a deliberate choice withholding a deliberate withholding of O'Neill's name that underscores the way that violence pulls even those who have no designated role into the stage of history to play their accidental anonymous part. Um, and I guess what this poem also reminds me of is sorry, is uh oh shoot. Yeats I cannot think of what it's called, like Unnamed Soldier, something like that. There's other poems that I think that this poem is in conversation with that are happening, post World War One, um, post World War Two poetry that are also kind of talking about the way that violence can be so anonymous, and this idea of people dying who weren't necessarily famous or considered important in the grand scheme of things. Okay, so I already talked about this about Haney. Um, I think one of the things to kind of keep in mind with Seamus Haney is that he was expected to write about the Troubles because he's a Northern Irish Catholic poet. And he was pretty beloved during his lifetime. I think people really expected him to speak up about this, but if you notice this poem, and this is one of his more famous ones, right? It is moving towards something more personal, I think, than overtly political. I think it's more about connecting with O'Neill as a person and thinking about who he was. It's not saying he's like an amazing person, he's really important. It's terrible for the country or for for art or something that he's died, but just kind of the idea that this violence has affected Haney on such a personal level, and then we get such a clear sense, I think, of who O'Neill was from this poem, and so I think the humanity there is kind of what's key, and I think that we'll see this a lot with Haney's poems as well. Not just that he has uses such beautiful language and meter and sensual detail, but also that his poems can be very personal. They feel it's not just about Ireland, but about, a very specific part of Ireland, and not just about a specific part of Ireland, but about him and where he's from in Ireland and his family and the people that he knows. I did also share in the slides a video about the Troubles. I'm not going to show the whole thing here, obviously, but if you do want to learn more about them, this was a short video that I found that seems to be pretty fair in its depiction. Like I said, there is some disagreement about events, like what happened, who did what, and things like that. But I think this one is a pretty fair portrayal. Let's move on to Philip Larkin. So very, very different poet. He is so he's born in 1922 to 1985. He's born in Coventry, England. He studied at Oxford, and then later he works as a librarian at Hull University Library. He worked there for decades, so he is really associated with that library. And when people think about what's great about that library, they tend to attribute it to him. Or at least, it's been a long time since he's worked there, but during, during and after his lifetime. Um, so he's one of the major writers of what's called the movement. And so we can see other writers here, Kingsley Amis, Donald Davy, Tom Gunn. These are writers who are really pushing back against modernism, right? So they thought modernism was inaccessible. They didn't like the obscurity. They don't like the kind of impersonality of it. And so Philip Larkin has this quote, and I think it's hard to read anything he says without a little bit of like sarcasm, or like you're kind of wondering when the other shoe's going to drop and he's going to say, like, something that makes you feel sad because he's a little bit of a mean guy, right? But he says, I don't want to transcend the commonplace. I love the commonplace life. Everyday things are lovely to me. And see, you see what I'm saying? Very simply positive. And so I'm like waiting, I'm like, and but he's pretty clear about having this sort of like dedication to clarity. And he's also very into like traditional, what he sees as traditional English poetry, not the stuff that has been kind of imported by people like Eliot, who was an expat, right? This kind of like hyper intellectual, inaccessible poetry, but something that's a little bit more down to earth. Okay, so Whitsun weddings, right? Context. So basically, Whitsun is the seventh Sunday after Easter. And and so apparently people get married on that day. It's a very, very common day to get married. So while what he's describing on this in this poem is his train trip as he is going through and looking through at all of these bridal parties, and he's making a lot of observations that are not super kind, right? But but he seems to be trying to be honest, and in describing kind of his journey and his realization of what's happening. Like I say here, it demonstrates his tone. He can be very like acerbic, right? Sometimes he's very funny, but it's kind of in a mean way, right? Some other things to note about this, we can sense his nostalgia for better times. And one of the things that I've read about this poem is that it's reflecting some of like post-World War II, um, I don't know, like disenchantment, kind of this sense of like things were better before the war. Um, and just kind of reflecting on how things have potentially changed to be worse. Okay, church going. So again, he's traveling. I love that. This is one of his most famous poems. He's traveling by bike in this poem. He stops at an old church. And again, we get just kind of hit over the head with how acerbic his tone is here. He says early in the poem, he reflects the place was not worth stopping for, right? We get it, Philip, but yeah, so he's kind of got this grouchiness. And I like the word grouchiness. I haven't read any other, literary scholars using that term for him, but I like the term grouchiness because I don't feel like he is uh like kind of almost like nihilistic or condemning society in a real serious and searing way. Um, like poets like Eliot potentially, you're right, or even like Matthew Arnold, who has this like very serious poem about religion in England and how like the country's lost its way. There's almost more of like I mean, maybe some of that is present, but I think that the way he's writing his poetry isn't so much in like this philosophical, intellectual kind of way. It is, remember, he's trying to stay down to earth. He's trying to stay in the commonplace. That's where he wants to spend his time. He wants to communicate with us. And so to me, it feels more like, man, kids these days, than it does like, you know, there's no point in continuing in this dark, dreary life. It's those are two very different kinds of messages, I think. And so, but he does have some overlap with some of these other poets, who are talking about these things, and specifically in this poem, maybe about religion and even architecture. He's talking a lot about the architecture of the church, but then I think we can see that kind of metaphor potentially there of the building, and it's, the Church of England, right? Okay, we're moving on now. Okay, so Chinua Achebe, 1930 to 2013, same year as Seamus Heaney, which is interesting. So he is born in Eastern Nigeria. Um, he is he goes to English speaking schools, studies at the University College Ibadan, and then he ends up working for several years as the director of external broadcasting at the Nigerian Broadcasting Company. This is going to come back up. So let's see. Let me come back. So he wrote what is considered one of the most important novels in English literature, period. Okay, not contemporary, not postmodernist, ever. Okay, and so the unfortunate, story here is that this is kind of like almost miraculous thing that this ended up happening, because he had written out his whole manuscript. It was his only copy. And, we're talking back in the day when people would have one copy of things. And then if it got lost in a flood or a fire, there's so many stories about this happening, by the way. If you want to make yourself feel, this great loss, just read about how many different manuscripts have been lost in those kinds of ways. It's a lot. So he has this manuscript that he's written. He sends it to a typing agency to get it all typed out so that he can, get it published. And he sends it to this agency. They say, okay, great, that's going to be, and they tell him the quote. He sends them the money, and then crickets. He doesn't get back the draft. It's never typed for him, and it's months pass by. And then he has his coworker at the Nigerian Broadcasting Company, or corporation. I'm sorry if I got that wrong, but the his coworker, she's like, oh hey, I'm going back to England, to visit. What's going on with you or whatever. He tells her about this typing agency that hasn't gotten back to him, and she's like, what? So she goes in there, and when she's in England, and she's like, hey, yeah, my friend sent you this manuscript and he hasn't heard anything back. He paid for it. So I think that's kind of weird. And apparently it's just like gathering dust in a corner in this office, right? They basically almost lost this thing. She told them, she said, it had better, she's like, I'm going to be back in England in 3 weeks. It had better beat me there. Right. And if you want to read more about the story, I love these kinds of stories where people stick up for their friends, and kind of the stories behind things getting published too. It's like very exciting. But they did. So it was typed. But one of the things that's so sad about the story is that Achebe said if this hadn't worked out, if he had permanently lost that manuscript, he might have just given up writing entirely, because there had been just sort of a series of events that had encouraged him to write. He'd had interactions with people, and he'd been successful in a few different situations, and he thought, I'm gonna try this thing. He writes this novel, and then he sends it off. And if you've written a novel, or honestly, if you've written pretty much anything, you know how devastating it can be when you lose that manuscript, when you lose that copy. And so he poured so much of his time into it and effort. And so, yeah, it was nearly lost. And instead, it's become one of the most famous works in English literature, and frequently rated among the best novels ever published in any language, in anything. Okay, so if you want to read the short version of that story, it's here at the slate.com place, but also Guernica Mag, they have an excerpt from his memoir that goes into more detail about that and about a few other things. Okay, so we're back. Some other things about him: he did try to start a publishing company, or he did start one, with the poet Christopher Okigbo, but his friend died shortly after the Nigerian War, Civil War started. And so that was from 1967 to 1970. And so the publishing company ended up not really working out. So Achebe was in a really bad car accident. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, so during the Civil War, Achebe went to the US. He was teaching here. And then he ended up moving back to Nigeria when the war was over to teach there. But he was in a terrible car accident, um, I think in 1990, and he was paralyzed. And so someone told him that he should go back to the United States. I don't I don't really know why. That's just what I've read. And so he did. He came back to the US and he taught at Bard College for a really long time, decades. And then he eventually did teach at Brown for a while before he passed away. Um, Another detail about him, just before I move on out of the slide, is he was a titled Igbo chief. And so we don't have a lot of time to go into all of this, but there are some people who, kind of talk about him. He had very specific ideas about, and I think we can understand why, about why people needed to have a certain background. They needed to have a certain authentic experience to be able to write about things, specifically about Africa and Africans, right? Um, um, and then sometimes people sometimes people question his authenticity, basically. But I just wanted to give you that detail so that you could see it's like people people, that's all I'll say. Okay. Things fall apart. So you might recognize this title. It's from Yeats's poem, Second Coming, turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer, things fall apart, the center cannot hold, right? And so that's where this title is coming from. This is his first novel, right? This is the one that got lost, that manuscript that was in a corner somewhere gathering dust. And it's considered his masterpiece. And so I always I always think about how that would be hard if your first novel was the one that everybody talks about as being your best novel, and you're like, but I've written so many since then. I wish people would say this about my new one, but it is just such an influential book. It's widely taught, and it's just really important for a lot of reasons. It sparked the Nigerian literary renaissance in the 1960s. It's influenced contemporary writers, and I'm getting ahead of myself again. Okay, we talked about this already. So plot, we only read one short chapter of it, and the chapter comes from part two of the book. And so a lot of the plot has already happened at that point. There's a lot of plot there. So I went ahead and kind of got a quote from Britannica that goes over the plot, I think, really beautifully in a short way without giving too much away in case you did want to read the whole book. But yeah, so basically there's a lot of like world building explanation of like who characters are and plot, like kind of early plot development at the beginning. There's like this accidental murder, accidental death, that leads to exile and a lot of conflict within the family. Um, and then later on we have these conflicts due to white colonizers and missionaries kind of coming in, and the kind of ripple effects that that has on the community. Um, okay, so this novel was published in 1956, I think. But it is still considered pretty much the quintessential African novel. Like it is just so important, that even this, 65, more than 65 years later, it is, people point to it and say that is the most important African novel. I mean, for a whole continent, right? So, but like I said, he has influenced contemporary writers, including Chimamanda and Ngozi Adichie, who I believe I shared a video, her TED Talk earlier in the semester, but I found it was quoted in another thing I was reading. So it says that before she discovered Achebe's writing, I didn't think it was possible for people like me to be in books. She talks about that pretty extensively in her TED Talk, on the danger of a single story. So some other things to kind of keep in mind, um, in terms of like if we're zooming out of the novel a little bit and thinking about it in the larger context of the English literature we've been reading so far this semester, one of the important things here is that Achebe was writing this in the very last years of British occupation of Nigeria. And so, you know, the tide was turning, right? People were definitely feeling less, there was a lot of tension. There was a lot of movement towards, all right, goodbye, self-rule, home rule, I think is the word I'm thinking of, which we've seen, for example, in the same thing was happening, similar thing, I should say, was happening in Ireland in what we're talking about earlier with Haney, right? Um, and so we have, you know, uh, in his work, we have these white colonizers coming in, these missionaries coming in, and the tension there, the criticism of that and those people. And another thing that we could look at when we're thinking about this novel, and one of the novels that this is frequently compared to, and something that he's talked about a lot too, is the way that this novel responds to writers like Joseph Conrad, who we did not read. um, I mean, you might go back and read Joseph Conrad if you like. He has this novel, Heart of Darkness. It's a majorly taught novel. I read it 3 times, once in high school, once in my undergrad, and then once in my master's program because it was assigned to me that many times. It's assigned a lot. Part of the reason it's assigned a lot is because it's short, which is very frustrating. But that is one of the reasons. It's also I think it's open now, so you don't have to pay for it, and schools don't have a lot of money. So okay. Um, but one of the problems with that novel, and look, people have pushed back against this, against Achebe after he said this. They're like, oh, but you're not really considering the fact that it's like a frame narrative, so we're getting this through this really unreliable narrator. Great. But anyway, Achebe is pointing out how this is an extremely problematic novel. The way that it's depicting Africans is extremely racist. I think he calls Conrad a thoroughgoing racist. Um, and so even considering that Joseph Conrad was probably, I mean, one of the things he's basically talking about how colonization is bad for the British, like how it is corrupting them, it's making them worse. Um, that's true. I think we can look back at that time and say this was really unethical and it affected British people in negative ways. You know, because of doing unethical things, it has a corrupting effect. But his depiction of Africans in the novel is just unbelievably racist. And so if you want to read more about that, I have a link here, an image of Africa. Like I said, I've had to read this novel 3 times. Um, I'm not a fan, to say the least. But I understand there's things to appreciate about it. Uh, but it's just unbelievably racist. Okay. Um, Things fall apart. Another thing that is important about this novel is that it's considered a very important post-colonial novel. And so when we're thinking about postmodern literature, contemporary literature, one of the most important movements that we have of this time is moving away from just decolonization to now post-colonial. Post-colonial is going to be defining a time period in which colonialism, this major type of colonialism that was so prevalent in, for example, the Victorian era, as we discussed then, that is not the same. It's over. Over is maybe a little bit of an exaggeration. Colonialism still exists, but and the effects are still present, but in the same form it no longer exists. Okay. Um, and so it's defining that time period, but it's also defining, and you know what, let me go ahead and read this because I probably butcher it, but the term can also be used to describe the concurrent project to reclaim and rethink the history and agency of people subordinated under various forms of imperialism. Okay, and so there's sort of this like movement to tell these stories that have been ignored or that have been told by outsiders, like like we're talking about with Achebe's story, and versus Conrad, for example. Um, and it's also talking about things like if you've heard of the term Orientalism by Edward Said, if you've heard people talk about Homi K. Baba, if you've heard, and kind of imperialism, and if you've heard of Frantz Fanon, and there's all of these different like major scholars of this era. I'm sure I'm forgetting important people. Those are the ones who I think about at the top of mind. What they're typically talking about is the way that they have been defined by a lot of times the British Empire, um, and then how they are fighting back against that definition. And it has been so, uh, the British writing about the people has been so prolific, and it's been going on for so long that this really is like almost like what is the reclaiming and rethinking, right? Like an unlearning kind of a process for the world, about people who are from India, or who are from Africa, or who are from any of these places that have been occupied for so long. Um, and so anyway, it's just an important word to be somewhat familiar with. You might learn more about it in the future. We can potentially talk about it even more next week when we're reading Salman Rushdie. But it's just going to be a really, really important movement, and continues, by the way, to this day to be a very important um, part of literature and part of conversations around literature. All right. I think that's everything. So I hope you have a good day. And next week's our last week of reading, so hang in there. We're almost there.